In a world where bread was a luxury and salt was worth its weight in gold, hunger crept into every village, every supper table. Even kings and queens didn't eat as well as we imagine. In the Middle Ages, food was so bad no one wanted to remember it. Welcome to everyone to this exploration of medieval cuisine. As you settle in and relax, I'd love for you to share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing how far our community of night owls reaches. If you enjoy unwinding by diving into the rich details of history, think about subscribing for more relaxing stories like this. Imagine a simple, rough table set for a basic meal. A bowl of watery, flavourless porridge, a tough chunk of coarse bread, and maybe, if you're lucky, a few bits of chewy, stringy meat. This was the fare that sustained most folks back in medieval times. While the kings and nobles were chowing down on elaborate multi-course banquets, the average peasant was scraping by on a diet that was as meagre as it was monotonous. What factors came together to make food in the Middle Ages so unappetising for the common people? Let's dig into this question and travel back to a time when just getting enough to eat each day was a real struggle. In a typical medieval peasant's home, you definitely wouldn't find the scent of exotic spices. Cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, pepper. These were all luxuries reserved for the wealthy, brought over from faraway lands by daring merchants. Picture what it must have been like to be a spice trader back then, navigating the dangerous Silk Road to bring a little bit of luxury to Europe. To give you an idea of how valuable these rare flavours were, back in the 11th century, a pound of nutmeg would cost you 7 fattened oxen. Because spices were so expensive, the average person had to make do with strong flavours like garlic, mustard, and vinegar to add a little something to their plain food. The lack of fresh ingredients really didn't help the blandness of peasant cooking. Without reliable ways to keep food from spoiling, fruits and vegetables were, at best, seasonal treats. If you were lucky enough to have a small piece of land, you might grow some hardy crops like onions, leeks, and cabbages. But that wasn't nearly enough to balance out a diet that was mostly grains. Breads and porridges made from barley, rye and wheat were the basis of most meals, sometimes with little help from legumes like peas and beans. While this kind of diet could fill you up, it was missing a lot of important nutrients, which led to widespread malnutrition and stunted growth. Meat, while highly valued, was rarely on the peasant's table. A family that was doing well might have a pig, some chickens, or even a cow, but these animals were valuable assets, so they weren't going to be slaughtered unless it was a special occasion. Meat was usually saved for things like weddings and religious celebrations, or when an animal got too old or sick to be useful for anything else. When meat was available, they used every single part of the animal from nose to tail. Organ meats were common fare for peasants, as were small birds and wild game that they caught by trapping or hunting. Of course, poaching on the royal lands was a risky business, and you could be severely punished if you got caught. Fish was easier to get than meat for people who lived near rivers or the ocean, but it was often preserved by drying, smoking or salting so it would last longer. The result was nothing like the delicate, flaky fillets that we enjoy today. Herring, cod and eel were some of the most common fish that people caught, and they would be packed into barrels with a lot of salt to prevent them from spoiling. Freshwater fish like carp and pike were considered a delicacy and were usually reserved for the nobles, who had their own private fish ponds on their estates. Because it was so hard to get fresh food, medieval cooks had to be pretty creative with how they preserved things. Pickling, fermenting and drying were all common ways to make food last longer. Cabbage would be shredded and fermented to make sauerkraut, cucumbers and onions would be pickled in vinegar, and fruits like apples and pears would be dried for winter storage. These preserved foods did add some much-needed variety to the peasant diet, but they were still nothing like the bright flavours of fresh produce. Even basic foods like bread and ale, which were the foundation of medieval diets, weren't always what they seemed. Dishonest bakers might add things like ground acorns, chalk, or even sawdust to their dough to make it stretch further. This resulted in loaves of bread that were as hard as rocks and about as nutritious. Ale was often watered down too, so that the people selling it could make more money. This didn't exactly give alewives a good reputation. Since clean drinking water was hard to come by, weak ale was often the only safe thing to drink. The brewing process helped kill off some of the harmful bacteria. This brings us to one of the least appealing things about eating in medieval times, the complete lack of hygiene. Without any understanding of germs or food safety, contamination was everywhere. Livestock were often kept right next to where people lived, for warmth and protection. Their waste would seep into the same areas where food was being prepared and eaten. In crowded cities, the streets were full of garbage and human waste, which polluted the water and attracted rats. It's no surprise that foodborne illnesses were common, and even royalty wasn't safe from eating spoiled food. King John of England, for example, is said to have died after eating too many peaches and drinking new cider, which probably gave him a fatal case of dysentery. The threat of disease was always present at the medieval dinner table. The Black Death, which killed off a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread partly because of the unsanitary conditions that allowed rats and fleas to thrive. Food markets were especially bad places for spreading disease, with flies buzzing around the meat and rodents running around underfoot. It's amazing that anyone made it through the dangers of eating in the Middle Ages at all. But even with all the scarcity and disease, there were still some bright spots. Monasteries and abbeys were often places where food was more plentiful, with gardens and orchards providing a lot of fresh produce. Monks were known for their cooking skills, and some even wrote cookbooks that gave us a glimpse into the more refined cuisine that the upper class enjoyed. Of course, this food wasn't freely shared with everyone, but some monasteries did give out alms to the poor as a form of charity. For the nobles, feasts were a chance to show off how rich and powerful they were. A royal banquet might have dozens of different dishes, from roast swan and peacock to fancy pastries and sweet treats. Spices were used generously and wine and ale flowed freely, creating an atmosphere of over-the-top indulgence. But even these fancy spreads had their dangers. Food poisoning was common, with spoiled meat and sauces making people sick, and just the sheer amount of food that people ate could cause digestive problems. It just goes to show that even the wealthy weren't immune to the risks of medieval dining. When we think about how tough food was to come by in the Middle Ages, it's hard not to be grateful for how much we have today. Our supermarkets are packed with fresh produce from all over the world. Our meat is safe and clean, and our spice racks are full of flavours that any medieval king would have been jealous of. But even as we enjoy all the benefits of modern life, we can't help but be amazed by how resourceful and resilient our ancestors were, making do with so little and finding ways to survive despite all the challenges. So the next time you sit down to eat, take a moment to appreciate everything you have. Savour the flavours and textures that medieval peasants could only dream of, and raise a glass to all the generations who worked and struggled to get us to this point. And if you ever find yourself complaining about a dish that's not quite perfect, think about the medieval diner, for whom even a simple bowl of porridge was a blessing. As we let our minds wander back to that distant time, let's take comfort in knowing that we're lucky to have inherited centuries of progress in cooking. And let's not forget the lessons that history can teach us. Lessons about perseverance, creativity, and the incredible ability of the human spirit to find nourishment and joy even in the darkest times. And so, dear listener, I wish you good night and sweet dreams of a world where food is not just something we need to survive, but a source of endless pleasure. May your own culinary journey be full of flavour, nourishment, and gratitude for everything we've been given. Until next time, rest well and dream of feasts yet to come. Part 4, Tampered Food and Drink. In the dimly lit streets of a medieval city, a baker looks around quickly before ducking back into his shop. He takes out a sack of sawdust and starts mixing it into the dough, trying to make his small amount of flour last longer. For a lot of bakers, this was the only way to make a living. Bread was essential to the medieval diet, but it was often not pure. Dishonest bakers would add fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or sawdust to make their dough go further. The result was a rough, gritty loaf that didn't have much nutrition. The very food that was supposed to keep peasants going through their hard work had become just another problem they had to deal with. Alien wine were also often tampered with because of how desperate people were. Alewives and innkeepers who were struggling to make money would water down their drinks to sell more of them. The drink that resulted was a weak, sour swill that didn't taste anything like the strong ale that the British Isles were known for. One alewife, Elizabeth, is working over her bubbling pot, adding another bucket of cloudy water. Her kids are nearby, watching every drop, knowing that their next meal depends on this batch. As she pours out a mug of the watered-down drink, she sighs, remembering the rich, full-bodied ale that her grandmother used to make. A family recipe that's now been lost because of necessity. In a time when clean drinking water was rare, these tampered with ales and wines became something people had to rely on, even though they weren't ideal. Wells and rivers were often contaminated by human and animal waste, which made them full of disease. The alcohol in these drinks, even though it was diluted, was still strong enough to kill some of the harmful bacteria. So peasants had to choose between risking getting sick from tainted water or drinking watered-down ale, which didn't have much nutritional value. People did try to stop these dishonest practices. The assize of bread and ale, a law from the 13th century, set rules about the price, weight, and quality of bread and ale. People who broke these rules faced big fines or even time in the pillory. But because there weren't many ways to enforce these laws, and because people were so desperate, they didn't do much to stop people from tampering with food. So the medieval peasant's life was one of constant compromise, balancing the pain of hunger with the disappointment of tampered with food. Every bite was a reminder of how unstable their lives were, where even the most basic foods couldn't be taken for granted. As we learn more about the realities of medieval food, we need to remember that these weren't just historical facts, but the daily struggles of real people. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the places where they lived made it even harder for them to get a decent meal. The close living quarters shared by people and animals, and the lack of sanitation in medieval cities, made the simple act of eating a dangerous thing to do. Part 5. Unsanitary living conditions. Picture a small thatch roof cottage trying to stay warm against the cold of a medieval winter. Inside, a family is huddled around a small fire, their breath mixing with the steam coming from a pot of soup. In the corner, a pig is digging around in the rushes that cover the dirt floor, snorting and grunting, which is a constant part of the family's daily life. This was how a lot of medieval peasants lived, in close quarters with their livestock. Animals were often kept inside the home for warmth and safety, their waste mixing with the straw and rushes that were used as flooring. It was a breeding ground for disease, with fleas and lice thriving in the unsanitary conditions. Even in the biggest castles, sanitation was a problem. Without knowing much about hygiene, even the most lavish feasts could end badly. The story of King John of England is a good example of this. In 1216, while travelling, the king got sick after eating too many peaches. Historians now think that these peaches were probably spoiled, which led to dysentery that eventually killed the king. In the crowded cities of medieval Europe, the situation was even worse. Narrow streets were filled with garbage and human waste, polluting the air and seeping into the water supply. In London, the River Thames was used as both a source of drinking water and a place to dump the city's waste. It's no wonder that disease was common, with outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and even the Black Death. The Black Death, which spread through Europe in the 14th century, was able to spread so quickly and kill so many people because of the unsanitary conditions in medieval cities. Fleas carried by rats that thrived in the filth became carriers of the plague, spreading the disease from person to person very quickly. For the average peasant, there was no way to escape these unsanitary conditions. They lived and died in the filth, their bodies weakened by malnutrition and constant exposure to disease. Even the simple act of eating, which should have been a source of nourishment and comfort, became a risk with every bite. When we think about these things, it's easy to feel bad for the medieval peasant. But even in this darkness, there were some bright spots. Neighbours sharing what little they had, and the comfort they found in faith and community. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the church, even though it played a role in the hardships of the time, also offered some relief and hope to the hungry and the downtrodden. Part 6. The Church's Influence. The ringing of church bells marked the rhythm of life in medieval Europe. For peasants working in the fields, these bells signalled not just a call to prayer, but also a break from their hard work and their hunger. In a world where so much was uncertain, the church was a source of stability and authority. But this authority came with its own set of rules and restrictions, many of which had to do with food. The Catholic Church required people to fast often and have meatless days, especially during Lent. For 40 days before Easter, people were supposed to avoid meat, dairy and eggs, which was hard for those who were already struggling to find food. The story of one peasant family shows how hard these fasts could be. John and his wife Margaret worked from sunrise to sunset on their small piece of land, barely growing enough food to feed their 3 kids. When Lent arrived, they had to make a difficult choice: follow the fast and risk weakening their already malnourished bodies, or disobey the church and risk punishment in the afterlife. In the end, they chose to follow the fast, eating small amounts of bread, soup, and the occasional dried fish. By Easter, they were thin and exhausted, but they took comfort in believing that their suffering would be rewarded in the next life. Despite the hardships these fasts caused, the church wasn't completely unaware of the problems of the poor. Monasteries and abbeys often provided food aid, giving bread and alms to those in need as a form of Christian charity. The monks, with their large lands and resources, were able to provide some relief to the hungry masses. But even this charity had its limits. When crops failed and famine struck, the demand for aid often exceeded the church's ability to provide. And for those who were caught poaching in the royal forests, trying to supplement their diets with fresh game, the church's mercy was noticeably absent. Poachers, if caught, faced severe punishments, from being maimed to being killed, regardless of their circumstances. So the church's influence on medieval food was a mixed bag. It provided comfort and aid to some, while placing additional burdens on others. For the peasant family, faith was both a source of strength and another trial to endure in the face of constant hunger. As we turn our attention to the final chapter of our journey through medieval food, we'll see a scene of shocking contrast, the opulent feast of a noble household. Against the backdrop of peasant hardship, these lavish displays serve as a stark reminder of the vast inequalities that defined the era. Part 7, The Rare Medieval Feast. The great hall of the castle is lit up by hundreds of candles. Tapestries line the walls, telling stories of heroic deeds and love. At the head of the room, on a raised platform, the lord and lady are presiding over a scene of extravagance. Down the centre of the hall is a massive oak table covered with countless dishes. Whole roasted pigs with golden crispy skin are crowded next to silver platters of spiced peacock. Baskets are overflowing with fresh white bread. The air is thick with the scent of saffron, cinnamon and cloves, spices that are so valuable they're worth their weight in gold. In the castle kitchens, the master cook is in charge of a culinary production. He barks orders at his assistants, who are busy basting the meats, stirring the pots, and plating elaborate dishes, including sugar sculptures shaped like castles and unicorns. For the cook, this feast is a chance to show off his skills and creativity, to improve his reputation and stay in his lord's good graces. As the feast goes on, the diners eat a seemingly endless variety of dishes. They tear into the tender meat of roasted venison, sip creamy almond soup and enjoy the delicate flavour of blancmange, a dish of shredded chicken mixed with rice, milk and sugar. They wash it all down with cups of spiced wine and frothy ale. But even with all the celebration, there are reminders of how unstable medieval life was. A noblewoman, her face red from wine, suddenly turns pale and leaves the table, her stomach upset by the richness of the food. A knight, his teeth rotting from the sugary treats, bites into a piece of meat that is too tough and winces in pain. And at the edges of the hall, the serving staff watch the excesses of their superiors with a mix of envy and resentment. They know that tomorrow they'll be back to their usual fare of coarse bread and thin soup. The memory of this feast is a reminder of the difference between their world and that of their masters. As the last plates are cleared and the final crumbs are swept away, they're left to think about the sharp contrasts of medieval food. For the nobility, feasts were a way to show off their wealth, status and power, a chance to enjoy the finest delicacies the land had to offer. But for most people, food was a daily struggle, a constant battle against scarcity, tampering and disease. In our modern world of abundance and choice, it's easy to forget the hardships faced by our medieval ancestors. But by understanding their struggles, we can better appreciate the comforts we enjoy today. As we sit down to our own meals, let's take a moment to enjoy not just the flavours, but the progress that allows us to eat with such ease and variety. And so, as we finish our exploration of medieval food, let's raise a glass, or a wooden cup, to the countless generations who came before us. Through their struggles and triumphs, their hunger and their hopes, they laid the foundation. Conclusion. As we've travelled through the world of medieval food, we've seen a world of scarcity, hardship and inequality. From the plainness of peasant soup to the dangerous ingredients in tampered bread, the challenges of feeding oneself in the Middle Ages were constant. We've seen how the lack of spices, the difficulties of preserving food, the unbalanced diets, and the unsanitary conditions all made medieval food very different from what we have today. We've seen how the church's fasting rules added to the burdens of the poor, and we've marvelled at the extravagant feasts of the nobility, a stark contrast to the harsh realities faced by most people. But through it all, we've also seen glimmers of humanity's resilience. The creativity of cooks making the most of limited ingredients, the solidarity of communities sharing what little they had, and the comfort found in faith and feasts. In our modern world, it's easy to take our abundance of food for granted. We can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia and cheeses from Europe, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We can eat in restaurants that serve cuisines from around the world, or have a world of flavours delivered to our homes. But imagine taking a medieval peasant and showing them the aisles of a modern grocery store. The variety would be overwhelming. The bright colours of the produce section, the refrigerated cases filled with milk and eggs, the shelves of pre-packaged meals and snacks. It would be like stepping into a fairy tale, a land of unimaginable plenty. And yet, even in our world of culinary riches, we still face our own challenges. We struggle with the environmental impact of our food systems, with issues of access and inequality, and with the health consequences of overeating. In our pursuit of convenience and choice, we sometimes forget the value of simplicity, of seasonal eating and local flavours. Perhaps there are lessons we can learn from our medieval ancestors. Even as we appreciate how far we've come, we can embrace the joy of sharing a meal with loved ones, the satisfaction of a dish made with care and creativity. We can remember the value of preserving and cherishing the bounty of the earth rather than taking it for granted. And most of all, we can approach our own meals with gratitude and wonder, recognising the incredible journey that food has taken to reach our plates. From the sunlit fields to the busy kitchens to the warmth of our own tables, each bite is a testament to the resilience and creativity of the human spirit across the ages. So, as we end our journey through the history of medieval food, let's raise a glass to the countless generations who came before us. Through their struggles and their triumphs, their hunger and their hopes, they laid the foundation for the world we inhabit today. By recognising and respecting their legacy, we unlock valuable insights and perspectives, enabling us to shape a future where food is accessible to all, promoting both joy and dignity in abundance. Imagine the royal cook, a whirlwind of activity in the castle kitchens, orchestrating an elaborate feast. Meanwhile, the majority of his compatriots could only fantasise about such extravagance. The serfs, those who laboured tirelessly in the fields, considered a meal a simple matter. Coarse bread and pottage, a thin stew concocted from whatever vegetables or scraps they could scavenge. If they were fortunate, perhaps a small piece of salted pork or dried fish might grace their bowl, adding a hint of flavour to the otherwise bland mixture. All too often, however, it was an uninspiring and unsatisfying meal, barely enough to quell the pangs of hunger. The life of a peasant during medieval times was one of relentless hardship, a reality most starkly evident in their daily sustenance. While the nobility indulged in exotic dishes seasoned with costly spices from distant lands, the common folk eked out an existence on a diet as monotonous as it was meagre. Even the privileged weren't immune to the dangers lurking within medieval food. The grand feast that defined aristocratic life often came with a hidden price. Lacking any means of refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat. Many a noble succumbed to illness or even death after consuming contaminated food. The very excesses designed to flaunt their wealth and status could ultimately lead to their demise. Such was the fate of King John of England, whose premature death in 1216 was attributed to an overindulgence in peaches. According to legend, the king was travelling through the town of King's Lynn when he was struck by a severe case of dysentery. Some attribute this to the rich food he had consumed at a nearby abbey, while others blame the peaches he had consumed with such delight. Regardless of the cause, the king's condition rapidly deteriorated, and he died a few days later, his reign cut short by a humble fruit. It serves as a sombre reminder of the precariousness of life in the Middle Ages, where even the most powerful and privileged were not shielded from the perils lurking in their food. For the vast majority of people, however, the risks were even greater. In a world where hunger was a constant companion, the temptation to consume spoiled or contaminated food was often irresistible. This was especially true during times of scarcity, when crops failed and food was in short supply. During these lean years, people would resort to eating whatever they could find, even if it meant jeopardizing their health or even their lives. Acorns, grass, and other wild plants were often ground into a coarse flour to make bread, while animals that had succumbed to disease were sometimes consumed out of desperation. Even in the best of times, medieval food was often adulterated in ways that are unimaginable today. Unscrupulous bakers would stretch their dough with fillers such as sawdust or chalk, while brewers would dilute their ale to increase their profits. These practices were not only dishonest but also dangerous, as they could lead to serious illness or even death. The alewife who sold her brew in the village tavern was a common figure in medieval life, often bearing the brunt of the community's suspicions and resentments. If her ale was weak or sour, she might be accused of adulterating it with noxious substances or even practicing witchcraft. In a world steeped in superstition, the line between a bad batch of ale and a deadly poison was often blurred. Despite the numerous challenges and hardships that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they were not without their small joys and comforts. For the peasant family gathered around the hearth at the end of a long day, a simple meal of bread and pottage could be a moment of respite and togetherness. For the monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to prayer and service, the austere diet prescribed by their religious orders could be a source of spiritual nourishment and discipline. Yet even within the monasteries and abbeys that dotted the medieval landscape, food wasn't always a source of comfort or sustenance. During the holy season of Lent, when Christians were expected to fast and abstain from meat, the already limited diets of the religious orders would be further restricted. For 40 long days, they would subsist on little more than bread, water, and the occasional vegetable or fish. For some, this period of deprivation was a welcome opportunity to focus on their spiritual lives and to draw closer to God. For others, it was a time of immense hardship and temptation, as the pangs of hunger gnawed at their resolve and tested their faith. In a world where food was so often scarce and unpredictable, the idea of voluntarily giving it up must have seemed like the epitome of insanity. Despite all the hardships and challenges that medieval people faced daily, they found ways to adapt and persevere. They learned to preserve their food through salting, smoking and drying to make the most of the meagre ingredients available, and to find joy and comfort in the simple pleasures of life. The story of medieval food is a story of resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity. It's a reminder of how far we've come regarding food safety, variety and abundance, but also of how much we still share with our ancestors. Just as they struggled to put food on the table and nourish their families, we grapple with the challenges of our time, from climate change and food insecurity to the pressures of modern life. As we sit down to our own meals, laden with a dizzying array of flavours and ingredients from all corners of the globe, it's easy to forget the hardships and sacrifices that have brought us to this point. By understanding the history of our food and how it has shaped our culture and identity, we can gain a greater appreciation for the abundance and diversity we enjoy today. So the next time you bite into a juicy apple or savour a slice of warm, crusty bread, take a moment to reflect on the long and winding road that has brought us here. Give thanks for the countless generations of farmers, cooks, and labourers who have toiled to put food on our tables, leaving us a legacy of resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of even the greatest challenges. Imagine a medieval peasant transported to a modern grocery store. They'd likely be overwhelmed by the sheer abundance and variety of food available. They might marvel at the exotic fruits and vegetables from distant lands, the gleaming displays of meat and fish, and the aisles upon aisles of packaged and processed foods. But they might also feel a sense of unease or even distrust, wondering about the hidden costs and compromises that have made such abundance possible. They might question the methods by which our food is grown and raised, the additives and preservatives that keep it fresh and appealing, and the impact that our food choices have on our health, our environment, and our communities. Ultimately, the medieval peasant might simply shake their head in wonder and return to their own time, content with the simple food that has sustained them for generations. While our modern food system offers greater choice and convenience than ever before, it's not without its own challenges and drawbacks. Just as the medieval peasant had to make do with what they had, finding joy and sustenance in the face of scarcity and hardship, we must learn to navigate the complexities of our own food landscape. We must learn to make choices that nourish not only our bodies but also our souls, honouring the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before us, and leaving a legacy of health and abundance for generations to come. Let's raise a toast to the humble peasant, the hard-working farmer, the skilled artisan, and all those who have laboured to put food on our tables throughout history. Let's savour the flavours and textures of the foods we eat, not just as a source of sustenance, but as a connection to the past and a promise for the future. Let's never forget the power of food to bring us together, nourish our bodies and spirits, and remind us of our shared humanity in the face of even the greatest challenges. As we've seen, the medieval spice trade was a lucrative but perilous business. Those who controlled the spice flow could amass great fortunes, while those who toiled to bring these precious commodities to Europe risked life and limb. One such spice merchant was Giovanni da Marinoli. Born in the early 14th century to a noble Florentine family, Giovanni seemed destined for a life of ease and comfort, but a restless spirit and a thirst for adventure led him down a different path. In 1308, Giovanni embarked on a journey that would take him across the known world, from the bustling ports of Italy to the distant lands of China and India. As a papal envoy and missionary, his official purpose was to spread the Christian faith. But Giovanni was also a keen businessman, always on the lookout for valuable spices and other exotic goods to bring back to Europe. Giovanni's travels were fraught with danger at every turn. He crossed the vast deserts of Central Asia, braving sandstorms and bandits. He navigated treacherous mountain passes in the Himalayas, battling altitude sickness and frostbite. He sailed the storm-tossed seas of the Indian Ocean, praying to survive each monsoon season. Yet for all the hardships he endured, Giovanni was also enchanted by the wonders he encountered. He marvelled at the gleaming white palaces of Khanbalik, the Mongol capital later known as Beijing. He admired the pious devotion of the Thomas Christians in southern India. He revelled in the heady scents and flavours of the spice markets in Son and Malabar. Along the way, Giovanni gathered a rich cargo of cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, carefully packed in chests to protect them from moisture on the long journey home. He knew that if he could safely bring these spices back to Italy, he stood to make a fortune. But Giovanni's luck was not to last. According to some accounts, his ship was lost at sea on the return voyage, taking him and his precious spices down to the briny deep. Other tales claim that he survived the journey, only to be robbed and murdered by brigands on the outskirts of Florence, his spices scattered to the wind. Whatever the truth of his fate, Giovanni di Marinoli's story reminds us of the incredible risks and rewards of the medieval spice trade. For a few wealthy merchants and lucky adventurers, spices could be a ticket to untold riches. But for most, like Giovanni, they remained a tantalising dream, always just out of reach. As we drift off to sleep, let's imagine ourselves in a bustling spice market in some far-flung corner of the medieval world. The air is thick with the scent of pepper and cinnamon, cardamom and saffron. Merchants haggle in a dozen different tongues, their voices rising and falling like the tide. We wander the narrow lanes, baskets in hand, marvelling at the colourful mounds of spices from every corner of the globe. Here, a pile of ginger root, gnarled and pungent. There, a heap of cloves, like tiny brown nails, their aroma warm and sweet. But as we fill our baskets, we can't help but feel a pang of regret for the many who will never taste these flavours. For the poor peasants back home, a pinch of pepper would be an unthinkable luxury, let alone a fragrant curry or a spiced wine. Their food, as we'll explore further, is a monotonous grind of gruel and grit. A far cry from the sumptuous feasts we've seen at the tables of the wealthy, but even those lavish banquets, as we'll soon discover, could come with their own hidden dangers and disgusting surprises. So let's savour this imagined abundance, this rare sensory delight, as we drift deeper into dreams. For when we wake, we'll have to confront once more the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, realities that made filling one's belly a daily battle for princes and paupers alike. The scarcity and hardship that defined medieval food for the masses extended even to the staples that formed the backbone of their diets. Bread, the most basic and universal of foods, was often a coarse, unappetizing loaf that would be nearly unrecognisable today. For poorer peasants, bread was made from lower quality grains like barley, rye, and even beans or chestnuts in times of shortage. This resulted in dense, dark loaves that were difficult to digest and provided little nutrition. The bread was often full of gritty impurities from poor milling techniques, and it would quickly go stale or mouldy in the damp conditions of many peasant homes. Even for slightly better off peasants who could afford wheat bread, the end product was a far cry from the fluffy leavened loaves we enjoy today. Leavening agents like yeast were expensive and hard to come by, so most bread was unleavened flatbread, similar to modern pita. These flatbreads would be baked on a hearthstone or dried in the sun, resulting in a hard, cracker-like consistency. The quality of bread was so important that it was often used as a marker of social class. The whitest, finest loaves made from pure wheat flour were reserved for the nobility, while the greyish-brown loaves of the peasantry were derided as black bread. In some regions, strict laws even prohibited commoners from consuming white bread, reserving it as a privilege of the elite. One figure who stood out in the history of medieval bread production was the 12th century mystic St. Hildegard of Bingen. Born into a noble family in what is now Germany, Hildegard entered monastic life as a young girl and rose to become the abbess of her own community. In addition to her visionary spiritual writings and musical compositions, Hildegard was renowned for her knowledge of herbalism and natural medicine. She wrote extensively about the properties of grains and the importance of proper nutrition, even at a time when such ideas were not widely understood. In her treatise Physica, Hildegard described spelt, an ancient grain closely related to wheat, as the best grain for human consumption. She believed that spelt bread nourished the body and enhanced longevity while cautioning against the consumption of raw cereals as damaging to health. Hildegard put her knowledge into practice, overseeing the extensive agricultural lands and bakery of her abbey. Under her guidance, the nuns of Bingen produced high-quality spelt bread that was distributed to the sick and poor in the surrounding community. Though spelt was still a luxury commodity out of reach for most peasants, Hildegard's advocacy of it as a healthier alternative to common wheat was remarkably prescient. Modern nutritional science has vindicated many of her claims, showing spelt to be higher in protein and easier to digest for many people than highly processed modern wheat. The life and work of Hildegard of Bingen provide a glimpse into the crucial role that bread played in medieval society, not just as a staple food, but as a symbol of social status and a potential tool for healing. Her teachings, informed by a holistic understanding of the connection between food and health, foreshadowed modern ideas about nutrition and wellness. Despite the efforts of visionaries like Hildegard, bread for most people in the Middle Ages remained a coarse, bland staple that was often scarce. The unequal distribution of the basic necessity was just one more way in which the stark class divides of medieval society manifested in its food culture. For the poorest peasants, even the meagre comfort of a regular supply of bread could be stripped away by the cruel twists of fate and weather. In times of drought, flood or blight, when grain crops failed, the spectre of famine loomed large over medieval communities. During these dreaded years of dearth, food prices would skyrocket while wages plummeted, leaving many peasants unable to afford even basic subsistence. With no social safety net to rely on, the poorest were left to starve or resort to desperate measures like eating bark, grass, or even cannibalism. One of the worst famines to strike medieval Europe was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. A catastrophic confluence of factors, including climate change, crop failures, and the economic fallout of endless wars, plunged the continent into a 7-year period of starvation and misery. Chronicles of the time paint a grim picture of the suffering endured by the common people. Men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, wrote the Flemish monk William of Nangus. Some men, it was said, compelled by hunger, ate the bodies of executed criminals, and some poor people even ate their own children. The famine hit the Low Countries and Scandinavia particularly hard, with mortality rates as high as 10 to 25% in some regions. In the German city of Erfurt, the famine years saw an average of 16 deaths per day, compared to just 2 per day in normal times. Even in the best of times, the threat of hunger was never far away for medieval peasants. Their precarious existence, always at the mercy of the elements and the whims of their lords, meant that food insecurity was a constant companion. The grim reality of famine cast a long shadow over the medieval world, serving as a reminder of the fragility of life in an era before modern agriculture and social welfare. It was a world where even the most basic necessity of bread could not be taken for granted, and where the spectre of starvation lurked just one bad harvest away. As we continue our journey through the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages, we'll see how this pervasive scarcity and insecurity shaped not just the diets, but the entire world view of medieval people. In a time when a full belly was a luxury and a stale crust a treasure, food took on a significance that is hard to imagine from our modern vantage point of abundance and choice. But first, let's turn our attention to another staple of the medieval diet that was scarcely more appetizing than the era's bread: meat. For all but the wealthiest nobles, meat was a rare treat reserved for special occasions. When it did appear on the menu, it often came in forms that would turn the stomachs of modern diners. In the absence of refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on various preservation methods to keep meat from spoiling. Salting was the most common technique, with heavily salted meats being a staple of winter diets. But the salt itself was often of poor quality, full of impurities that could make the meat taste bad or even cause illness. Smoking and drying were also used to preserve meats, particularly in the form of sausages and hams. These could keep for longer periods but would become hard and unappetizing over time, with a texture more akin to leather than to the juicy tender meats we enjoy today. For most peasants, meat usually meant tough, stringy cuts from older animals that were no longer useful for milk or labour. Beef was rarely eaten by commoners, as cattle were simply too valuable to slaughter. Pork and poultry were somewhat more common, but were still luxury items for most. The type and amount of meat in medieval diets varied significantly by region and social status. In Slavic regions and parts of Scandinavia, people largely relied on freshwater fish rather than terrestrial meat. Hunting was a cherished privilege of the nobility, who jealously guarded their exclusive rights to venison and other game meats. A vivid glimpse into the inequality of medieval meat consumption comes from the records of King Richard II's cooks in the late 14th century. For a single royal feast in 1387, the kitchens prepared 2,000 chickens, 400 sheep, 500 stags, and 1,000 little pigs. Fair fit for a king indeed. In contrast, a peasant family might expect to eat meat only a handful of times per year, usually on major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter. Even then, the cuts would be meagre, and had likely been scrupulously saved for months. But for one brief moment in the history of medieval England, the humble peasantry got a taste of the bounty usually reserved for their betters. In the aftermath of the Black Death, which killed up to half the population in the mid-14th century, the massive labour shortage gave surviving peasants newfound bargaining power. With fewer mouths to feed and a surplus of land, many peasants found themselves in the novel position of being able to demand higher wages and better living conditions. For a few short decades, the standard of living for English commoners actually improved markedly. Meat consumption rose as more peasants could afford to keep livestock for their own tables rather than for the markets. Wages doubled or even tripled in some regions, allowing labouring families to supplement their usual fare of porridge and bread with the occasional chicken, pig or even cow. But this golden age for the peasantry was short-lived. The landed nobility, alarmed at the rising power of the lower classes, fought back with laws attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and tie peasants to the land. The tensions between the emboldened peasantry and the reactionary aristocracy would erupt in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Though the revolt was brutally suppressed, with its leaders executed and its gains largely rolled back, it stands as a testament to the transformative impact of the Black Death on medieval society. For a brief shining moment, the common people of England got a taste of a life less constrained by scarcity and toil. For most of the Middle Ages, and for most people, meat remained a rare and coveted treat. Its scarcity made it a potent symbol of status and wealth, a tangible reminder of the chasm between the haves and have-nots. In the great halls of castles and manors, nobles and knights feasted on heaping platters of roasted game and delicate fowl, washing it down with fine wines and honeyed mead. But in the hovels of the peasantry, a scrap of salted pork or a stringy chicken leg was a hard-won delicacy to be savoured and stretched as far as it could go. This disparity in access to such a basic foodstuff underscores the harsh inequalities that defined life in the Middle Ages. In a world where even a full belly was a mark of privilege, the gulf between rich and poor was as wide as the distance between a king's banquet table and a peasant's empty trencher. As we've seen, the rare morsel of meat was a highlight in the otherwise dreary and monotonous diet of most medieval people. Even this small pleasure was subject to strict regulation by the power of the Church. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church wielded immense influence over every aspect of daily life. Food was no exception back then. The church calendar was marked with fast days and meatless days where eating any animal products was strictly prohibited. The most important of these times was Lent, the 40 days before Easter. During this period, meat, dairy and eggs were completely off limits, leaving people to live on a simple diet of fish, vegetables and bread. For rich nobles, this wasn't a big deal. They could easily import fancy fruits, nuts and spices to make their Lenten meals more interesting. And their well-stocked fish ponds made sure they always had fresh seafood. But for the poor, Lent meant an even more limited and boring diet than usual. The Church's reason for these food rules was about penance and spiritual discipline. By not letting themselves enjoy earthly pleasures, even in the form of food, people thought they were cleaning their souls and connecting with Christ's suffering. But in a world where most people were always hungry and didn't have much food, the idea of choosing to go without must have seemed pretty ironic. For peasants who hardly ever ate meat anyway, having even more restrictions probably felt like a cruel joke. But the Church was so powerful that very few people dared to openly disobey its food rules. Doing so risked being shunned by society and the very real threat of going to hell. Back when the afterlife was considered more real and important than life on Earth, this was a strong warning. One sad story that shows how hard Lenten fasting was comes from records of an English manor in the 14th century. In 1322, a peasant woman named Agnes Paston was brought before the manor court for stealing 2 loaves of bread during Lent. To defend herself, Agnes said she had stolen the bread to feed her starving children, who were too young to understand the fasting rules. She begged for mercy, saying that surely God wouldn't want her innocent babies to go hungry. The court, moved by her sorry, made the unusual decision to let Agnes off the hook for stealing, but they still told her off for breaking the Lenten fast, reminding her that the needs of the soul had to be more important than the desires of the body. For Agnes and many others like her, the strict food rules of the Church must have seemed like just another problem in a life that was already hard and full of hunger. In a world where food was scarce and just surviving was difficult, the idea of willingly giving up what little food they had must have been hard to accept. But the church's effect on medieval food culture wasn't all bad. Monasteries and abbeys were often leaders in agricultural innovation, coming up with new ways to rotate crops, irrigate land, and selectively breed plants and animals. They also kept ancient knowledge about farming and food preservation alive, preserving the wisdom of ancient Rome and Greece. Also, the church played a key role in giving food aid to the poor and hungry. Monasteries were known for giving bread and ale to the needy, and many ran hospitals and almshouses to care for the sick and poor. Before there were social welfare programs or organised charities, the church was often the only safety net for the most vulnerable people in society. Its teachings about the good of charity and the sin of gluttony helped create a moral reason for those with money to share what they had with those who had less. Of course, this charity often came with a lot of paternalism and moral judgment. The poor were expected to be thankful for whatever little they got and to accept their place in life as something God had planned for them. But for people on the edge of starvation, even a small act of kindness could be the difference between life and death. As the Middle Ages went on, the food gap between the rich and the poor only got wider. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was experiencing what some historians call the Little Ice Age, a time of colder temperatures and frequent weather problems. Crop yields went down as fields were hit by droughts, floods, and unseasonable frosts. Food prices went way up, leaving many common people unable to afford even basic foods. At the same time, the Black Death and later waves of plague had killed off a lot of the population, leading to labour shortages and rising wages. In response, the nobles and the growing merchant class really went all in on showing off their wealth and status by eating extravagantly. Lavish banquets with fancy dishes and over-the-top displays of sugar sculptures and gilded peacocks became common. Meanwhile, the poor were left to survive on whatever little bits they could find. In times of famine, many had to eat famine bread, which was made from a desperate mix of peas, beans, acorns, and even sawdust. Others had to forage for wild plants or hunt any animals they could catch, from rodents to crows. But even with all this extreme inequality, there were some signs of hope and resistance. Peasant revolts like the English Walsur Rising of 1381 and the German Peasants' War of the early 16th century showed the common people rising up to demand better treatment and a fairer share of the wealth. While these uprisings were often brutally put down, they still showed the unkillable human spirit and the lasting dream of a world where everyone could have the basic dignity of enough food and a decent life. And in the kitchens and gardens of ordinary people, the seeds of a more vibrant and diverse food culture were being planted. Women, who were mostly responsible for feeding their families, were the unsung heroes of medieval cooking. With creativity and resourcefulness, they found ways to get flavour and nutrition out of even the simplest ingredients. In the folk traditions of pickling, preserving and foraging, they passed down knowledge that would help their communities survive the hard times and lay the groundwork for the culinary revolutions to come. And in the communal ovens and shared meals of village life, they fostered a spirit of solidarity and resilience that was as sustaining as any loaf of bread. So while the story of food in the Middle Ages is definitely one of hardship and deprivation, it's also a story of ingenuity, resilience and hope. In the face of scarcity and oppression, medieval people found ways to nourish not just their bodies, but also their spirits, finding joy and connection in the simple act of sharing a meal. As we look back on this distant and often difficult past, we can be inspired by their example. In a world that is still divided by inequality and hunger, their story reminds us of the fundamental human right to food and the vital importance of fighting for a more just and sustainable food system. And in our own kitchens and around our own tables, we can honour their legacy by cherishing the abundance we enjoy and always remembering to share it with those who have less. For in the end, the true measure of a society isn't in how fancy its feasts are. But as we've seen, for most people in medieval Europe, food was a daily struggle of scarcity, monotony, and even danger. But there was one place where the food was always plentiful, always varied, and always exquisite: the royal court. While peasants survived on gruel and stale bread, nobles feasted on the finest delicacies the land had to offer. Imagine being the royal cook, entrusted with the monumental task of preparing lavish meals for the king and his court. Your day begins before dawn as you oversee the delivery of ingredients from far and wide. Wagons roll into the castle courtyard laden with barrels of wine from Burgundy, wheels of cheese from the Alps, crates of spices from the Orient. The king's huntsmen ride in with deer and boar slung over their saddles, ready to be transformed into savoury roasts and pies. In the cavernous castle kitchens, a small army of servants bustles about under your command. Fires roar in the great hearths as spits turn slowly, roasting meats to perfection. Cauldrons bubble with fragrant stews and soups. While bakers knead dough for bread and pastries, the air is thick with the aroma of exotic spices. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, each worth more than its weight in silver. As the hour of the feast approaches, you put the finishing touches on your creations, a magnificent roast swan, its plumed neck curving gracefully on the platter, a gleaming aspic studded with gems of fruit and topped with gold leaf, a towering subtlety in the shape of the king's coat of arms painted in vibrant hues. Each dish is a work of art crafted to delight the eye as much as the palate. When at last the noble guests file into the great hall and take their seats, it's time for your masterpieces to be unveiled. Servants parade the platters in, presenting each to the high table with a flourish. As guests ooh and ah as they are served, marvelling at the bounty before them. For a few glorious hours they dine like gods, sampling delicacies from every corner of the known world. But even here, in this rarefied realm of the royal court, the spectre of illness lurks behind the splendour. For all their expense and artistry, even the most sumptuous dishes could harbour deadly spoilage, and the sheer excess of the feast often led to overindulgence, as nobles gorged themselves far past the point of satisfaction. It wasn't unheard of for a courtier to literally eat himself to death, felled by his own gluttony. So while the royal feast may have stood in stark contrast to the meagre rations of the common folk, it was not without its own perils. In a world without refrigeration or food safety standards, no one was truly safe from the dangers of the dining table. Rich or poor, the medieval relationship with food was always a precarious one. Today we can scarcely imagine the hardships that our ancestors endured simply to fill their bellies. The poorest among us have access to a variety and quality of food that would have been unthinkable even for medieval kings. We can walk into a gleaming supermarket and find fruits and vegetables from every season, meats and cheeses from every continent, spices and sauces from every cuisine. We can eat what we want when we want without fear of famine or food poisoning. But perhaps in our abundance we have lost something as well. The medieval peasant, for all his suffering, likely felt a deep connection to the land and the turning of the seasons. He knew intimately the sweat and toil that went into every mouthful. While we may pity him his limited options, he would likely look upon our pre-packaged, mass-produced meals with a mixture of wonder and horror. One can imagine a medieval serf transported to the snack aisle of a modern grocery store, marvelling at the colourful bags and boxes stretching out before him. He picks up a shiny packet, turning it over in his weathered hands. Cheetos, he reads slowly, sounding out the unfamiliar word. Made with real cheese. He shakes his head in disbelief. Real cheese for a mere peasant. Impossible. He puts it back on the shelf and moves on, overwhelmed by the strange bounty of this new world. As we drift off to sleep, bellies full of whatever we desire, let us take a moment to reflect on the privilege of choice. Let us remember the countless generations who came before, who fought and scraped and starved so that we might have the luxury of a full larder. And let us be grateful for the simple, everyday miracle of enough to eat. As the sun set over the bustling port city of Venice, a weary spice merchant named Luca disembarked from his ship, his precious cargo of exotic spices from the east secured tightly in his satchel. Luca had spent months traversing the treacherous Silk Road, braving bandits, sandstorms, and searing heat to bring a taste of faraway lands to the tables of wealthy Europeans. For Luca and merchants like him, the spice trade was a lucrative but perilous endeavour. The demand for spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves and saffron was insatiable among the nobility, who used them to flavour their rich dishes and show off their affluence. But for the common folk, these fragrant seasonings remained an unattainable luxury, their meals remaining sadly bland and unappetising. As Luca navigated the winding canals of Venice to deliver his wares to his wealthy clientele, he couldn't help but reflect on the stark divide between the opulent feasts of the rich and the meagre rations of the poor, their palates never knowing the lively tang of pepper or the warm, sweet embrace of cinnamon. The life of a spice merchant was one of constant movement and danger, with fortunes won and lost on the whims of the sea and the shifting sands of the desert. Luca had seen his fair share of hardships on his journeys, attacks by marauding bandits, treacherous mountain passes, and the ever-present threat of disease. But he pressed on, driven by the promise of riches and the thrill of the unknown. As he made his final deliveries and counted his profits, Luca couldn't shake the feeling that for all the wealth and prestige the spice trade brought him, it remained a bitter reminder of the deep inequalities that plagued medieval society. While he dined on saffron-infused stews and fragrant spiced wines, the common people went to bed with growling stomachs, their dreams haunted by the enticing aromas that wafted from the kitchens of the elite. With a heavy heart, Luca retired to his lavish villa for the night, knowing that tomorrow he would once again set sail for distant lands, chasing the promise of fortune and leaving behind a world where the simple pleasure of a flavourful meal remained an unattainable dream for most. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a weary housewife named Matilda stirred from her slumber, her mind already racing with the countless tasks that lay ahead. For Matilda and countless other women across medieval Europe, the arrival of autumn heralded not a season of bountiful harvests and joyous feasts, but rather a time of ceaseless labour and gnawing anxiety about the looming spectre of winter. With the days growing shorter and the nights turning colder, Matilda knew that she had precious little time to preserve what meagre crops her family had managed to coax from the unyielding earth. Every scrap of food was precious, and nothing could be allowed to go to waste, lest they face the unthinkable prospect of starvation in the bleak months ahead. As she set about her work, Matilda's mind wandered to the lavish feasts of the nobility, where sumptuous meats and exotic delicacies were consumed with wanton abandon. For her and her fellow peasants, such extravagances were little more than cruel jests, taunting reminders of the vast chasm that separated the haves from the have-nots in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. With calloused hands and an aching back, Matilda toiled from dawn until dusk, salting and smoking what little meat they had managed to raise, pickling vegetables in precious vinegar, and hanging herbs to dry in the rafters. The work was monotonous and exhausting, but she couldn't afford to rest, knowing that every morsel she preserved now could mean the difference between life and death come winter. As the days wore on and the leaves began to turn, Matilda's thoughts turned to the harsh realities that lay ahead. Even with all her hard work, she knew that the winter would be a time of scarcity and hardship, with meals consisting of little more than coarse bread and thin gruel. Day after day, the spectre of hunger was a constant companion, lurking just beyond the threshold, waiting to sink its icy claws into the vulnerable and the weak. But even in the face of such bleak prospects, Matilda found solace in the knowledge that her tireless efforts would at least give her family a fighting chance. With a fierce determination burning in her heart, she continued her labours, her hands raw and her spirit weary, but her resolve unshakable. For in a world where famine and privation were constant threats, the simple act of preserving food was an act of defiance, a stubborn refusal to submit to the unyielding cruelty of fate. As the first snowflakes began to fall and the chill winds of winter swept across the land, Matilda could only pray that her labours had been enough. With a heavy heart and an empty larder, she prepared to face the long, dark months ahead, knowing that for her and countless others like her, the struggle for survival was only just beginning. In a grand castle nestled amidst rolling hills and verdant forests, a lavish feast was underway. The great hall filled with the raucous laughter and clinking of goblets as nobles from far and wide gathered to partake in an extravagant display of wealth and power. At the head of the table sat the lord of the manor, his bejewelled fingers tearing into a succulent roast swan, his delicate flesh flavoured with exotic spices from distant lands. All around him, the tables groaned under the weight of countless delicacies. Savoury meat pies, rich stews and decadent pastries, each one a testament to the skill of the castle's master chefs. The air was thick with the aroma of roasting meats and the heavy scent of mulled wine, a sensory feast that stood in stark contrast to the meagre rations of the serfs toiling in the fields beyond the castle walls. For these lowly peasants, the very notion of such a feast was little more than a cruel fantasy, a tantalising glimpse of a world forever beyond their reach. As they huddled in their draughty hovels, their bellies gnawing with hunger, they could only dream of the rich flavours and sumptuous textures that graced the tables of their betters. Their own meals, if they could even be called that, consisted of little more than a thin gruel made from whatever scraps and leftovers they could scrounge together. A few lucky ones might have a meagre crust of bread to gnaw on, but for most, even that was a rare luxury. The thought of meat, let alone the succulent delicacies being devoured by the nobles, was little more than a distant fantasy. As the feast wore on and the wine flowed freely, the nobles grew ever more boisterous, their laughter ringing through the halls and echoing off the stone walls. They traded bawdy jokes and tales of their exploits, their faces flushed with the warmth of the fire and the satisfaction of their overindulged appetites. But beyond the castle walls, the serfs huddled in their misery, their stomachs cramping with hunger and their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they would likely never know the pleasures of a full belly or a contented smile. For them, life was little more than an endless cycle of back-breaking labour and gnawing hunger. the cruel whims of fate forever conspiring to keep them in their place. As the last embers of the feast's great fires died out and the nobles retired to their plush chambers, the serfs returned to their own meagre dwellings, their minds haunted by the tantalising aromas and raucous laughter that had filled the night air. With heavy hearts and empty stomachs, they settled in for another long, cold night, the spectre of hunger their constant companion, and the dream of a better life little more than a cruel, taunting mirage. In the bustling streets of a medieval town, an alewife named Agnes hurried to and fro, her arms laden with jugs of her latest brew. Agnes was a stout, no-nonsense woman who'd been brewing ale for as long as anyone could remember. It was a hard life, fraught with long hours and meagre profits, but it was the only life she had ever known. As she made her way through the winding alleys, dodging the refuse and filth that littered the streets, Agnes couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt over the shortcut she had taken with her latest batch. Times were tough and the price of grain had skyrocketed, leaving her with little choice but to stretch her ale with a bit of extra water. It was a risky move, one that could land her in hot water with the local authorities if anyone found out. But what choice did she have? Agnes knew that her customers, mostly hard-working labourers and craftsmen, relied on her ale to provide brief respite from the drudgery of their daily lives. They craved the rich, hearty flavour and the pleasant buzz that came with a few pints after a long day's work. But with the cost of ingredients eating into her already meagre profits, Agnes had been forced to cut corners wherever she could. As she arrived at the tavern and began to unload her wares, Agnes couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was betraying her customers' trust. She took pride in her craft, and the thought of serving them watered-down swill made her stomach churn. But what choice did she have? It was either adulterate her brew, or risk losing everything she had worked so hard to build. With a heavy heart, Agnes began to serve her customers, watching as they eagerly quaffed down the subpar ale, their faces contorting in disappointment as they realised that something was amiss. Some grumbled under their breath, while others outright complained, demanding to know what had happened to the usually stellar brew. Agnes did her best to deflect their questions and assuage their concerns, but the guilt continued to gnaw at her. She knew that her actions were wrong, but in a world where survival was a daily struggle, sometimes compromises had to be made. As the night wore on and the crowd began to thin, Agnes finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She surveyed the empty jugs and the meagre pile of coins on the counter, a bitter reminder of the harsh realities of her trade. With a weary sigh, she began to clean up, her mind already racing with worries about how she would make ends meet in the days to come. For Agnes and countless other alewives like her, the struggle to survive in a world of scarcity and hardship was a constant battle. Each day brought new challenges and difficult choices, and the line between right and wrong often blurred in the face of desperation. But still they persevered, driven by the hope that someday, somehow, their hard work and sacrifice would pay off, and they would finally know the taste of a better life. In the grand halls of a medieval palace, a royal cook named Guam scurried about the kitchen, his brow furrowed in concentration as he oversaw the preparations for the evening's lavish feast. Guam was a master of his craft, renowned throughout the land for his ability to create culinary masterpieces that dazzled the senses and left even the most discerning palates in awe. As he moved from station to station, barking orders and sampling sauces, Guam couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at the opulence and extravagance that surrounded him. The kitchen resembled a beehive, buzzing with activity as scullery maids and kitchen boys hurried back and forth. They carried armfuls of the finest ingredients from every corner of the kingdom. Plump capons and juicy roasts sat waiting, their skins shimmering with honey and spices, alongside mountains of fresh fruits and vegetables, so vibrantly coloured they practically jumped off the platters, not to mention the delicate pastries and sweets, each a miniature masterpiece. It was a clear demonstration of the royal court's wealth and might, and Guam revelled in his pivotal role as the creative force orchestrating it all. Yet even as he revelled in the admiration for his culinary triumphs, Guam couldn't quite shake off the unease that lingered in the back of his mind. He knew all too well the glaring contrast between the extravagant banquets he concocted for the elite and the meagre scraps that passed as meals for the common people. This division weighed heavily on him, although he was also acutely aware that speaking out against it would jeopardize everything he had worked so tirelessly to achieve. As the final touches were applied and the first course was presented, Guam discreetly observed from the shadows as the nobles settled into their seats, their faces beaming with eager anticipation. He noticed the way their eyes widened with delight as they sampled his creations, the murmurs of approval and nods of satisfaction that spread through the crowd. For a fleeting moment, He permitted himself to enjoy the fulfillment of a job superbly executed. But as the evening unfolded and the revelry became more intense, Guam couldn't shake the persistent feeling of disquiet that tugged at his conscience. He couldn't help thinking about the countless hungry people beyond the palace walls, the emaciated faces and vacant eyes of those who had never experienced the satisfaction of a full meal. As the last of the plates were cleared away and the nobles retreated to their chambers, their stomachs straining from the excessive indulgence of the feast, Guam finally allowed himself a moment of respite. He leaned heavily against the kitchen wall, closing his eyes, his heart burdened by the weight of the injustice he had witnessed. In that moment, he couldn't help but contemplate what life might be like in a world where food wasn't a privilege reserved only for the privileged few, but a fundamental right available to everyone. He realized that such a world was likely just a pipe dream, a fantasy as distant and unattainable as the stars themselves. Still, he couldn't suppress the hope that someday, somehow, things might improve, and the abundance he created in the palace kitchens might somehow find its way to those who needed it most. Until that day arrived, Guam knew he would continue to practice his craft, his hands forever marked by the guilt of the abundance he created and the poverty he inadvertently perpetuated. It was a burden he would carry with him always, a constant reminder of the cruelty and inequality that permeated the medieval world. As we've journeyed through the annals of medieval history, examining the harsh realities and glaring inequities that characterise the era's food culture, it's hard not to feel grateful for the relative abundance and variety that we take for granted in the modern age. The challenges and hardships experienced by our ancestors, from the humblest serf to the most skilled artisan, serve as a sobering reminder of just how far we've come in our efforts to ensure that everyone has access to the basic necessities of life. Yet even as we celebrate the progress we've made, it's important to remember that the spectre of hunger and malnutrition still looms large in many corners of the world. Even amidst plenty, there are still people who go to bed with empty stomachs and heavy hearts, their dreams haunted by the same cruel inequalities that plagued the medieval world. As we reflect on the lessons of the past and the challenges of the present, it becomes clear that the fight for food justice is far from over. It's a struggle that will require the combined efforts of all who believe in the fundamental human right to nourishment and sustenance. A struggle that will test our resolve and compassion in equal measure. But even when faced with such daunting odds, we must never lose sight of the progress we've achieved and the hope that sustains us. We must draw strength from the courage and resilience of those who came before us, those who toiled in the fields and laboured in the kitchens, their hands worn and their hearts burdened by their struggles. And we must continue to push forward, fighting for a world in which no one goes hungry and where the bounty of the earth is shared equitably among all who call it home. It's a vision that may seem distant and out of reach, a dream as fragile and fleeting as the wisps of steam rising from a bowl of gruel. But it's a dream worth fighting for, a dream that has the potential to transform the world and bring hope to the hearts of all who yearn for a better tomorrow. So let's move forward with renewed purpose and determination, equipped with the knowledge of the past and the hope of the future. Let's work to build a world where the abundance of the palace kitchens reaches the tables of the poor and where the joys of the harvest are shared by all who have laboured to bring it to fruition. Because ultimately, the struggle for food justice isn't just about filling stomachs and satisfying hunger. It's about the very essence of what it means to be human, about the bonds of compassion and empathy that unite us all across the distances of time and space. It's a struggle that will demand all of our strength and courage, but it's a struggle we cannot afford to lose. So let's proceed with open hearts and willing hands, ready to do our part in the great endeavour of building a world where everyone can experience the simple pleasure of a full stomach and a contented smile. In that world, the legacy of medieval food culture will not be one of scarcity and deprivation, but one of abundance and hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to triumph over even the darkest of times. Of course, for the peasants who worked the fields tirelessly from sunrise to sunset, such extravagance was totally beyond their imagination. They existed on the most basic of foods, never truly feeling full. A typical meal might consist of a watery barley or rye porridge known as pottage, along with a chunk of hard coarse bread. If they were lucky, they might get a small piece of tough cheese or a handful of shriveled peas to add some substance. Meat was a rare treat, perhaps a bit of tough stringy salted pork on a special holiday like Christmas or Easter. The lack of variety in the peasants' diet was truly striking. While the nobility enjoyed delicacies from faraway lands, the common people ate the same bland things day after day. There was little to break the routine except for the changing seasons which determined what meagre crops were available. In the spring, tender greens like nettles or dandelions might provide a welcome change from the usual fare. In the summer, they could gather a few precious fruits, small hard apples or bitter crab apples, from the woods. Autumn brought the harvest season, a time of hard labour, but also a brief period of plenty with fresh grains and maybe a slaughtered hog or two to make salt meat for the long winter ahead. Ah, winter, the hardest and most dreaded season for the medieval peasant. As the days got shorter and the nights bitterly cold, families huddled around smoky fireplaces, their stomachs aching with hunger. Whatever food they had left from the harvest had to be carefully rationed, given out in small portions to last until spring. This was the time of year when the pottage became thinner and more watery, and the bread even harder and more difficult to chew. Starvation was a constant threat, always waiting to claim the weak and vulnerable. It's hard for us to imagine such an insecure existence where a single bad harvest could mean disaster for a whole village. But for most people in the Middle Ages, this was the harsh reality of everyday life. They were at the mercy of the weather, the nobility, and the often cruel whims of fate. A mouth to feed was as much a burden as a blessing. Another empty stomach to fill with limited resources. Even those who were a little higher up the social ladder there, like skilled craftsmen or successful freemen, rarely ate much better than their poorer neighbours. They might add a bit of butter or a scrap of meat to their pottage, but the basic monotony stayed the same. The same was true for the monks in their abbeys and monasteries. While they generally ate better than the common people, with bread, cheese, fish and ale, their diet was still pretty simple by today's standards. Rich spices and exotic ingredients were only for the tables of the nobility. Speaking of ale, it was the most common drink in the Middle Ages, drunk by people of all ages. Clean drinking water was often hard to find, and the fermentation process offered some protection against diseases carried in the water. But even this small comfort could be spoiled by dishonest brewers who watered down their product with questionable additives. Dishonest bakers might do the same with bread, mixing the precious wheat flour with cheaper grains, bran, or even sawdust and chalk. Such tricks were officially frowned upon and could be severely punished if discovered. But the desperate conditions of the time made them all too common. This was a world where getting enough food was a daily struggle, a never-ending cycle of work and hunger for everyone except a select few. The nobles in their grand halls, eating elaborately prepared dishes and drinking fine wines, seemed to live in a completely different world from the dirty, half-starved peasants working their land. It was a clear divide, one that caused resentment and sometimes even open rebellion. But more often it created a kind of grim acceptance and the feeling that this was just the way things were. A peasant's job was to suffer and endure, to scrape out a meagre living from a harsh land and hope for a better life after death. But even in the middle of such hardship, there were moments of relief and celebration. Holidays and feast days offered brief glimpses of plenty, when even the poorest people might enjoy a bit of meat or a sweet pastry. Weddings, christenings, and other important events were celebrated with communal meals, a chance for neighbours to come together and share what little they had. These brief moments of togetherness made the hard times easier to bear, a reminder that even in the face of great difficulty, the human spirit could endure. And endure they did, these tough medieval people. They carried their burdens with a strength and determination that's hard to understand from our modern perspective. They faced each day with a grim determination, knowing that their survival depended on their own hard work and cleverness. In a world where starvation was always just around the corner, there was no time for laziness or self-pity. Maybe that's why stories of great feasts and fantastic foods were so popular in medieval culture. In a society where hunger was the norm, stories of tables piled high with juicy meats, fresh fruits, and sweet treats offered an exciting escape from reality. Myths and legends often featured magical pots that never ran out or enchanted lands where no one ever went hungry. These imaginative stories spoke to a deep, unquenchable desire for plenty in a world defined by scarcity. But while the medieval peasant might dream of such wonders, their daily reality was still one of constant hardship, the threat of famine always present, ready to strike at the first sign of disease or drought. And even in good times, the diet of the common people was terribly inadequate by today's nutritional standards, heavy on grains and lacking in pretty much everything else. This left much of the population malnourished and vulnerable to disease. This long-term malnutrition had wide-ranging effects on medieval society. It slowed growth, weakened immune systems, and made childbirth even more dangerous than it already was. It drained strength and energy, leaving peasants poorly equipped to handle the demanding labour that was their lot in life. And it added to the general feeling of misery and hopelessness that hung over so much of the medieval world like a cloud. Yet despite all of this, life went on. Crops were planted and harvested, babies were born and raised, and the great cycle of life kept turning. The medieval peasant might not have had much in the way of material possessions, but they had their faith, their family, and their community to support them. They found joy where they could in the simple pleasures of a warm fire on a cold night or a full stomach after the harvest feast. And they endured season after brutal season with a resilience and courage that's hard not to admire. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate the amazing variety and abundance you have at your fingertips. Think about your medieval ancestors who lived and died depending on the success of the harvest, and be grateful for the centuries of progress and plenty that separate us from those harsh, hungry times. Because while the medieval peasant might have dreamed of a magical land of endless feasts, we're fortunate enough to live in a world where that dream is almost within reach. And that's a privilege we should never take for granted. The suffering of the medieval peasant was made even worse by the unbalanced nature of what they ate. While the nobles feasted on all kinds of meats, fruits and vegetables, the average serf ate a diet mostly made up of grains. Porridge, gruel and coarse bread were the main part of their food, along with whatever small amounts they could get from their work. A typical peasant family might consider themselves lucky to have a cow, a pig, or a small group of chickens, but the milk, eggs and meat from these animals were a rare treat, saved for special occasions or times of great need. More often than not, any extra was sold or given as rent to their feudal lord, leaving little for the family to eat themselves. Imagine, if you can, the big difference between a noble's fancy feast and a serf's simple meal. In the castle's great hall, the tables are overflowing with roasted meats, tasty pies, exotic fruits and fine cheeses. The air is filled with the smells of saffron, cinnamon and cloves as richly dressed lords and ladies eat with pleasure. Meanwhile, in the cramped hut of a peasant family, a pot of thin gruel simmers over the fire. The mother carefully divides the small serving, making sure each member of the family gets just enough to keep the hunger at bay. The children's eyes light up when they see a small piece of bread, a special treat added to their usual food. The unbalanced diet of the peasant took a heavy toll on their health. Malnutrition was widespread, weakening their immune systems and making them more likely to get sick. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a common disease that led to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and eventually death if not treated. In times of famine, known as seasons of dirt, things got even worse. Crop failures caused by drought, floods, or pests could be devastating for whole areas. With no extra food to fall back on, peasant families were left to starve, their weakened bodies falling victim to hunger and disease. One especially terrible story comes from the writer Henry of Livonia, who described a famine in the early 13th century. He wrote of peasants who were so desperate that they started eating dogs, cats, and even the dead bodies of people. While such extreme actions were rare, they serve as a grim reminder of how uncertain life was for the medieval peasantry. The unfair distribution of food in medieval society was a clear sign of the strict class system of the time. While the nobility enjoyed a varied and plentiful diet, most people lived on the edge of starvation, their meals simple and meagre. This difference would continue for centuries, with only gradual improvements in farming methods and social changes slowly reducing the gap. As we continue our exploration of the culinary world of the Middle Ages, we turn our attention to another problem that affected the population: food and drink that had been tampered with. In a time before strict rules and quality control, dishonest merchants and producers often cut corners and deceived their customers for the sake of profit. One common item that was often tampered with was bread, a basic part of the medieval diet. Bakers who wanted to stretch their limited supplies of flour would mix in all kinds of questionable ingredients. Ground acorns, chalk, sawdust, and even ground bones were used to bulk up the loaves. The bread that resulted was often heavy, gritty, and lacking in both taste and nutrition. Ale and wine, preferred drinks of the time, were also often tampered with. Since clean drinking water was often hard to find, these fermented drinks were considered a safer option. However, dishonest brewers and sellers would often water down their products to increase their profits, resulting in weak, tasteless drinks that did little to quench the thirst or improve the mood. The story of Agnes, the alewife, shows the temptation to cheat on one's products. Agnes, a widow struggling to make ends meet, depended on the small profits from her brewing to support herself and her children. One particularly difficult year, with grain prices rising and her customers decreasing, Agnes made the unfortunate decision to water down her ale, stretching her limited supply to sell more of it. At first, her deception went unnoticed, and Agnes felt relieved as the coins clinked into her purse. But soon word spread about the weak, tasteless brew, and her once loyal customers began to look for other alehouses. Agnes's reputation was ruined, and she was forced to close her doors, leaving her family to face an uncertain future. While medieval authorities did try to regulate the quality of food and drink, enforcement was often weak and inconsistent. The Assize of Bread and Ale, a 13th century English law, set strict standards for the weight and price of these basic items, but bakers and brewers found creative ways to avoid the rules. Fines and public shaming were common punishments for those caught tampering with their products, but the lure of easy profits often outweighed the risk of being caught. The prevalence of tampered food and drink in medieval society added another layer of misery to the already difficult lives of the common people. Not only were their diets monotonous and lacking in nutrition, but they also had to worry about being cheated or made sick by dishonest producers. It was a harsh reminder of the powerlessness of the masses in the face of a system that was stacked against them. As we delve deeper into the realities of medieval food, it becomes clearer that the romantic idea of a bountiful rural past is far from the truth. For most people, eating was a daily struggle filled with scarcity, monotony, and the constant threat of tampered goods. In a world where food was literally a matter of life and death, the medieval peasant had little choice but to make do with whatever meagre sustenance they could find. But the challenges of medieval dining weren't just limited to the quality and amount of the food itself. The very environment in which people ate was often a source of discomfort and even danger. In our next chapter, we'll explore the unsanitary conditions that plagued the medieval world and how they added to the overall misery of the era's culinary landscape. Picture, if you can, a typical peasant home in the Middle Ages. The small, cramped space is shared not only by the human inhabitants, but also by a collection of livestock. Chickens peck at the dirt floor, while a pig searches the corner for any stray bits of food. The air is thick with the strong smell of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and wood smoke. In such close quarters, it was often hard to tell the difference between the living space and the barnyard. Livestock were kept indoors not only for their own safety, but also for the warmth they provided during the cold winter months. However, this came at a high cost in terms of cleanliness and hygiene. Animal waste, combined with the general lack of cleanliness, created a breeding ground for disease. Flies buzzed constantly, spreading dirt and contamination from one surface to another. The very food that the peasants depended on for survival was often tainted by the unsanitary conditions in which it was prepared and eaten. The results of this lack of hygiene were terrible. Digestive problems, parasitic infections, and food poisoning were common, weakening the population. Even the highest levels of society weren't safe from the dangers of contaminated food, as the story of King John of England shows. In the year 1216, King John was travelling, fighting against rebel barons who wanted to limit his power. During a stay in the town of Lynn, he enjoyed a feast of peaches, a rare treat for the time. However, without the king's knowledge, the peaches had been stored improperly and had started to rot. Driven by hunger and a love of exotic fruits, John ate his fill, only to become violently ill shortly after. Suffering from dysentery and fever, the king's health quickly declined. He continued with his campaign, but his weakened condition made him vulnerable to the elements. While crossing the dangerous tidal flats of the Wash, John's baggage train was lost to the rising waters, taking with it his crown jewels and other treasures. The king himself barely escaped with his life, but his days were numbered. Less than 2 weeks later, he died from his illness. His reign cut short by a simple meal of tainted fruit. King John's fate, while more dramatic than most, wasn't unusual in a world where food safety was a rare luxury. The medieval landscape was full of potential dangers. From spoiled meat to contaminated water sources, even the air itself could be a source of danger. The theory of miasma, which was popular at the time, held that bad smells and bad air were the main causes of the spread of disease. Medieval cities, with their narrow winding streets and piles of rotting garbage, were seen as especially dangerous environments. The stench of human waste, rotting food, and industrial pollution mixed together in a foul brew that was thought to be the source of all kinds of illnesses. In reality, of course, it was the unsanitary conditions themselves that allowed diseases to thrive. The Black Death, which decimated approximately 1/3 of Europe's population during the 14th century, wasn't caused by miasma or bad air, as some believed. Instead, it was spread by fleas carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The densely populated and unsanitary conditions prevalent in medieval cities created an ideal breeding ground for the disease, allowing it to spread rapidly like wildfire. The impact of these unsanitary conditions on medieval food culture cannot be emphasised enough. It wasn't just about unpleasant smells and occasional bouts of sickness. It was a pervasive and deadly threat that loomed over every meal. The simple act of eating, which we often take for granted today as a pleasurable and nourishing experience, was fraught with danger and uncertainty for the average medieval peasant. In a world where even the most basic standards of hygiene were often lacking, food became not just a source of sustenance, but also a potential vehicle for disease and suffering. This, combined with the scarcity and monotony of the peasant diet, created a culinary landscape that was as bleak as it was unappetising. As we continue our exploration of why food in medieval times was so unappealing, it's important to remember that the challenges we've discussed so far, the limited variety, the difficulties of preservation, the unbalanced diets, and the unsanitary conditions, weren't the only factors at play. In the next section, we'll turn our attention to the role of the church in shaping the culinary habits of the time, and how religious doctrines often compounded the already considerable hardships faced by the average medieval diner. But first, let's take a moment to appreciate the incredible resilience and adaptability of our ancestors. In the face of unimaginable adversity, they found ways to survive and even thrive, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape our world today. As we tuck into our own meals, let's spare a thought for the medieval peasant whose daily struggle for sustenance was a testament to the indomitable human spirit. For the medieval peasant, the hardships of daily life were further compounded by the strict religious doctrines of the Catholic Church. In a society where the Church wielded immense power and influence, its teachings and edicts permeated every aspect of life, including the most basic of human needs, food. Central to the Church's dietary restrictions were the concepts of fasting and abstinence. On specific days throughout the year, particularly during the season of Lent, the faithful were required to abstain from consuming meat and to limit their overall food intake. For the already undernourished peasantry, these restrictions could be particularly burdensome, adding another layer of difficulty to their already precarious existence. Imagine, if you will, the plight of a poor peasant family during the 40 days of Lent. Already subsisting on a meagre diet of gruel and bread, they were now expected to forego even the occasional scrap of salted pork or dried fish that provided a modicum of flavour and sustenance to their meals. The growling of empty stomachs became a constant companion as they struggled to maintain their piety in the face of gnawing hunger. The story of John and Matilda, a fictional but all too typical peasant couple, illustrates the hardships faced by many during this time. With a small plot of land and a few scrawny chickens, they barely managed to feed themselves and their 3 children during the best of times. When Lent arrived, they dutifully put away their meagre stores of preserved meat and resigned themselves to a diet of thin gruel and boiled turnips. As the days wore on, their energy flagged and their tempers frayed. The children, too young to understand the reasons behind their deprivation, cried incessantly from hunger. John, a devout man, struggled to maintain his faith in the face of such hardship, while Matilda secretly dreamed of the savoury stew she would make when Lent was finally over. The couple's plight was not unique. Across the land, peasant families faced similar struggles, their already meagre diets further restricted by the dictates of the church. Some, driven by desperation, resorted to poaching in the royal forests, risking severe punishment if caught. Others simply went without, their bodies weakening and their spirits breaking under the weight of their devotion. While the intentions behind the church's dietary restrictions were ostensibly noble, to encourage spiritual reflection and penance, their impact on the peasantry was often dire. In a society already plagued by scarcity and inequality, the added burden of religious fasting could be the difference between life and death, pushing already vulnerable people to the breaking point. Yet even in the midst of such hardship, there were glimmers of hope and compassion. Monasteries and abbeys, with their vast land holdings and well-stocked larders, often served as a source of food aid for the poor. Monks and nuns, bound by their vows of charity and hospitality, would distribute bread and ale to the hungry, providing a brief respite from the gnawing pain of an empty belly. One such story tells of a kind-hearted abbess named Hildegard, who, upon seeing the gaunt faces of the peasants who came to her abbey seeking alms, ordered her kitchens to prepare a hearty pottage of vegetables and barley to be distributed to all who asked. The grateful recipients, their spirits lifted by this unexpected act of kindness, returned to their homes with renewed strength and a glimmer of hope in their hearts. Such acts of compassion, however, were all too rare in a world where the divide between rich and poor was vast and unyielding. The church, for all its teachings of love and charity, was often complicit in maintaining the rigid social hierarchy that kept the peasantry in a state of perpetual poverty and hunger. As we reflect on the role of religion in shaping the culinary landscape of medieval Europe, it's important to recognise the complex interplay of faith, power, and social inequality that defined the era. For the peasantry, food was not merely a matter of sustenance, but a daily reminder of their place in a world where even the most basic of human needs could be subject to the whims of the powerful. In our final chapter, we'll explore the concept of the medieval feast and how it served as a stark contrast to the daily realities faced by the common people. Through the lens of this lavish display of wealth and abundance, we'll come to understand the true depths of the inequality that defined the era and the ways in which food served as both a source of nourishment and a symbol of social division. But first, let's pause for a moment and imagine ourselves in the place of the medieval peasant, their hunger a constant companion and their faith tested by the unyielding dictates of the church. In their struggles and their resilience, we may find a deeper appreciation for the abundance and choice that we so often take for granted in our own lives. As we have seen, the life of a medieval peasant was one of constant hardship and deprivation, with food being a daily struggle rather than a source of pleasure or comfort. Yet in stark contrast to this bleak reality, there existed another world entirely, that of the royal feast. In the grand halls of castles and palaces, the nobility would gather to indulge in lavish banquets that were a far cry from the meagre fare of the common people. These feasts were not just a display of wealth and power, but also a symbol of the vast chasm that existed between the ruling class and the masses. Imagine, if you will, the scene of a grand medieval feast. The great hall is lit by the flickering light of countless candles, their warm glow illuminating the rich tapestries and gleaming silver that adorn the walls. The tables are laden with a vast array of dishes, each more sumptuous than the last. At the centre of the table sits a magnificent roasted boar, its crisp golden skin glistening with fat. Surrounding it are platters of roasted fowl, their succulent flesh stuffed with exotic spices and herbs. There are pies filled with tender game, their flaky crusts hiding a treasure trove of savoury delights. And everywhere there are fruits and vegetables of every hue, their vibrant colours a testament to the bounty of the land. Presiding over this opulent display is the royal cook, a master of his craft who has spent days preparing for this grand occasion. He has scoured the countryside for the finest ingredients, sourcing the freshest meats. And part 4, adulterated food and drink. In the dimly lit, cramped streets of a medieval town, a baker named Alric wiped the sweat from his brow as he toiled over his latest batch of bread. The harvest had been meagre this year, and grain prices were soaring. To make ends meet, Alrich had resorted to secretly stretching his dough with fillers like ground acorns, sawdust, and even chalk. It was a common practice among unscrupulous bakers, looking to maximise their profits, even if it meant compromising the quality and safety of their bread. As Alric worked, his mind wandered to the alewife down the street, who was known for watering down her brew to make it last longer. In a world where clean drinking water was often scarce, ale and wine were the beverages of choice for most people. However, this also meant that the quality of these drinks was often questionable, at best. In larger cities, the authorities did attempt to regulate the food and drink trade to some extent. Ale tasters were employed to ensure that brews met a certain standard, and bakers found to be adulterating their bread could face fines or even public humiliation. In London, for example, dishonest bakers might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with their substandard loaves hung around their necks. However, these regulations were often poorly enforced, and the punishments were not always a sufficient deterrent. Many bakers and brewers simply saw the fines as a cost of doing business and continued to cut corners wherever they could. For the average person, this meant that the food and drink they consumed were often of dubious quality. Bread that was supposed to nourish them might instead be filled with inedible or even harmful substances. Ale that was meant to quench their thirst might be so watered down that it provided little refreshment. It was just another hardship in a life already filled with challenges and uncertainties. As Ulrich pulled his latest batch of bread from the oven, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. He knew that his customers trusted him to provide them with honest, wholesome food, but in a world where survival often meant cutting corners and bending the rules, he felt he had little choice. He could only hope that his small deceptions went unnoticed, and that his bread would provide some small comfort to those who ate it, even if it wasn't quite what it seemed. Part 5. Unsanitary Conditions. In the year 1216, King John of England sat down to a lavish meal after a long day of hunting. As was customary, he was presented with a variety of dishes, including fruit, meat, and sweetmeats. However, unbeknownst to the king, the peaches he consumed that day were spoiled, likely due to improper storage and handling. Shortly after the meal, John fell violently ill with dysentery, a disease that would ultimately claim his life. While the exact cause of King John's death has been debated by historians, his story illustrates a stark reality of medieval life. Unsanitary conditions were rampant, and they took a serious toll on people's health and well-being. In many medieval households, livestock were often kept inside the home for warmth and safety. While this arrangement provided some comfort and security, it also meant that homes were constantly contaminated with animal waste and vermin. Fleas, lice, and rats were common companions, spreading disease and making life miserable for the home's human occupants. The situation was even worse in medieval cities, where garbage and human waste were often simply dumped into the streets or nearby rivers. With no understanding of germ theory or the importance of hygiene, people lived in close proximity to filth and squalor, creating the perfect breeding ground for disease. The consequences of these unsanitary conditions were severe. Dysentery, like that which killed King John, was a common killer spread through contaminated food and water. Other diseases, like typhoid fever, cholera, and even the dreaded Black Death, also thrived in the filthy conditions of medieval cities. For the average person, there was little escape from the constant threat of illness. Even the food they ate and the water they drank were often tainted with disease-causing microbes. In a world without antibiotics or modern medical knowledge, even a minor infection could quickly become life-threatening. The story of King John's death, while notable due to his status, was far from unique. For rich and poor alike, the spectre of disease and death was a constant presence, fueled in large part by the unsanitary conditions in which they lived. It was a grim reality of medieval life, and one that would persist for centuries until the advent of modern sanitation and hygiene practices. As the sun set over the medieval city, the stench of waste and decay hung heavy in the air. In the distance, the bells of the church tolled, a sombre reminder of the many lives claimed by the filth and squalor of the streets. For the people of the city, it was just another day in a world where cleanliness was a luxury and disease was a constant companion. Part 6. The Influence of the Church. In a small cottage on the outskirts of a medieval village, a peasant family gathered around their meagre evening meal. The fare was simple, a thin pottage made from vegetables and a scrap of salted pork, accompanied by a hard crust of bread. It was Lent, and the family was doing their best to honour the church's mandate to fast and abstain from meat during this holy season. For the peasants, the Lenten fast was a particularly difficult challenge. Their diets were already severely limited by their poverty and the scarcity of food. Giving up what little meat they had access to meant subsisting on an even more meagre and monotonous diet than usual. The church's influence on medieval cuisine was significant and far-reaching. In addition to the Lenten fast, the church also mandated meatless days throughout the year, typically Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. For the wealthy, these restrictions were an inconvenience, but for the poor, they could mean the difference between a full belly and hunger. Despite the hardships imposed by the church's dietary rules, there were some small consolations. Monasteries and abbeys often provided food aid to the hungry as a form of charity. Monks and nuns would distribute bread, ale, and sometimes even meat to the poor, particularly on holy days and festivals. However, this charity was not always enough to alleviate the suffering of the peasantry. In times of extreme scarcity, some peasants resorted to poaching game from the royal forests, risking severe punishments if caught. The church, in collaboration with the secular authorities, strictly enforced these hunting bans, viewing poaching as a sin against God and a crime against the king. As the peasant family finished their meagre Lenten meal, they bowed their heads in prayer, thanking God for what little they had. They knew that the fast would not last forever, and that Easter would bring a brief respite from the monotony and scarcity of their diet. But they also knew that the church's influence on their daily lives would continue long after Lent had ended. The cycle of fasting and feasting, of scarcity and abundance, was woven into the very fabric of medieval life, shaping not only what people ate, but how they lived and worshipped. In the grand cathedrals and humble parish churches, the priests preached the virtues of fasting and self-denial. But for the peasants, these virtues were not a choice but a necessity. They lived their lives in the shadow of the church, their stomachs growling with hunger as they prayed for a better world to come. Part 4. Adulterated food and drink. Even when food was available, there was absolutely no guarantee it would be wholesome or pure. In a world without industry regulations or any kind of meaningful safety standards, deception and cutting corners was rampant. Think about the plight of some humble baker, just trying to eke out a living by selling his bread to the townspeople. Desperate to stretch his already meagre supply of flour, he might try mixing in fillers like ground acorns, sawdust, or even chalk. While these nasty additives might have bulked up the loaves of bread, they sure didn't make for a nutritious or appetising meal, did they? Now, the bakers weren't the only culprits, not by a long shot. Unscrupulous brewers and vintners were notorious for watering down their wares to maximise profits. In a time when genuinely clean drinking water was scarce, people relied heavily on ale and wine to quench their thirst. But the alcohol content of these beverages was often far lower than what was advertised. This left the drinker unsatisfied and still incredibly parched. Picture an alewife in some bustling medieval town constantly surrounded by thirsty patrons all clamouring for a pint. She's ladling out this weak, watery brew with a super guilty conscience, knowing full well that she's cheating her customers. But what choice does she really have? The taxes are high, the grain is expensive, and she really needs to make ends meet somehow. She silently thanks heavens that the vast majority of her clientele are already far too drunk to even notice the blatant deception. But it wasn't all selfish greed driving these deplorable acts of food fraud, though. In a society that was constantly plagued by scarcity and hunger, many people simply couldn't afford to be overly picky. They would gladly accept a loaf of bread filled with sawdust over absolutely no bread at all. And when the crops failed and a full-blown famine struck, people resorted to eating anything they could get their trembling hands on just to survive. Things like grass, roots, and even tree bark were on the menu. Some feeble attempts were made by the local authorities to try to crack down on these despicable food adulterators. In England, the Assize of Bread and Ale in the 13th century set out some pretty harsh penalties for bakers and brewers who were caught cheating their customers. Fines, public humiliation, and even some pretty serious corporal punishment awaited those who dared to tamper with the purity of life's staples. But with fairly limited means of enforcement and the constant gnawing pressure of absolute scarcity, such lofty laws did very little to actually stem the massive tide of food fraud in the medieval world. So next time you bite down hard into a fresh crusty baguette or take a refreshing sip of some cool crisp lager, take a brief moment to appreciate how incredibly far we have come as a society. In our modern world of abundant food choices and stringent quality control, it's honestly very easy to forget that for our medieval ancestors, every single morsel of food was a bit of a gamble, and a full belly was certainly never a guarantee. Their daily sustenance was as much a product of deception and desperation as it was of actual nourishment and true pleasure. Part 5. Unsanitary conditions. Beyond the multitude of challenges of constant scarcity, rapid spoilage, and widespread adulteration, the poor people of the Middle Ages also had to contend with the ever-present spectre of incredibly dangerous disease. In a world that was utterly without anything close to resembling germ theory or modern sanitation, food and drinking water were often tainted with dangerous pathogens, which turned every single meal into a literal potential game of Russian roulette. The very living conditions of medieval folks conspired directly against any basic notions of actual food safety. Many peasants actually shared their humble cottages with their precious livestock, with animals like cattle and chickens living directly under the very same roof as the peasant family. While this particular arrangement did provide some much-needed warmth and security for the actual beasts, it also meant that nasty animal waste and pesky insects were a constant presence inside the home, directly contaminating all the food, the drinking water, and every available surface. The major cities were actually even worse, with narrow, filthy streets and impossibly crowded tenements creating the perfect breeding ground for all kinds of horrible diseases. Garbage, untreated human waste, and decaying animal carcasses were literally piled high in the overflowing gutters, tainting all the fresh air and inevitably seeping into the precious water supply. The ungodly stench alone would have been utterly overwhelming to our modern sensibilities, but the far real danger lurked in the literal millions of virulent microbes swarming on just about every single surface. It's honestly no wonder that medieval people had such drastically short lifespans, with disease cutting down both the young and the old, seemingly at random. Even the super wealthy nobility weren't somehow immune, despite their undeniably superior living conditions. The tragic story of King John of England actually serves as a perfect cautionary tale of sorts. In 1216, while he was on a military campaign, the king just gorged himself on some peaches and cider, only to then fall violently ill, ultimately dying just a few short days later. The chroniclers at the time directly attributed his sad death to pure gluttony, but more modern historians actually suspect that the real culprit was more likely to have been some serious food poisoning caused by incredibly contaminated fruit. The greatest scourge of the entire medieval world, the infamous Black Death, was at least in part directly enabled by the incredibly unsanitary conditions that these poor people were actually living in. The dreaded plague was primarily spread by rats and their persistent fleas, both of which had really thrived in the unrelenting squalor of medieval cities and towns. With uncollected garbage and waste constantly piling up and basic hygiene standards being virtually non-existent, it was really only a matter of time before this pestilence took a strong hold, eventually wiping out a full third of the entire European population. It's a super grim picture to be sure, but it's vital to remember that medieval people really weren't completely ignorant or utterly unconcerned about simple cleanliness. They may not have actually understood the science behind the precise transmission of these virulent diseases, but they certainly recognised the importance of keeping their food and their water as clean as possible. Monasteries and busy hospitals often had incredibly strict hygiene rules in place, and medieval housewives took some great pride in keeping their own homes as incredibly spotless as possible, all things considered. But in a world that had absolutely no refrigeration, no proper sewage systems, and no clean running water at all, there really was only so much they could actually do. Every single day was an exhausting battle against the ever-present forces of natural decay and contamination. And far too often, those dark forces actually won out in the end. So the next time you are happily enjoying a tasty meal in your clean modern kitchen, spare just a brief thought for your medieval ancestors who valiantly fought that incredibly difficult battle every single day of their lives, with the actual odds stacked firmly against them at all times. Part 6. The influence of the Church. In the medieval world, the Catholic Church loomed incredibly large over basically every aspect of life, and food was definitely no real exception. For the truly faithful, the religious calendar dictated what could actually be eaten and precisely when, adding an extra layer of intense complexity to an already challenging food landscape. The Church mandated some incredibly strict fasting and abstinence rules, particularly during the sombre penitential season of Lent. For the entire 40 long days before Easter, any kind of meat was strictly and totally off the menu, as were any dairy products, eggs, and even regular olive oil in some really strict regions. Fish was sometimes permitted, but for many of the poorest peasants, even that was a genuine luxury that they could ill afford. Try to imagine the intense struggle of some poor peasant family, already barely living on the very brink of absolute starvation, now faced with the terrifying prospect of having to give up what very little meat and dairy they had for the perceived sake of actual spiritual purity. The relentless growling stomachs and incredibly weakened bodies were supposedly just a small price to pay, they were solemnly told, for the enticing promise of genuine eternal salvation. But of course, that was very cold comfort indeed for a loving mother, just helplessly watching her precious children slowly grow visibly thin and extremely listless from constant hunger. Even completely outside of Lent, the somewhat subtle influence of the omnipresent Church could be directly felt in the persistent rhythms of the weekly menu. Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays were permanently designated as lean days, when delicious meat was completely forbidden. For the fairly wealthy, this simply meant directly substituting in some fish or other luxuries. But for all the extremely poor, it often unfortunately meant going completely without any sort of animal protein at all. There were some small mercies to be sure, however. Monasteries and abbeys often happily provided food aid to all of the hungry as a key part of their overall mission of genuine charity. Kind monks would actively distribute bread, warm soup and good ale to anyone needy, always offering a rare, welcome respite from the seemingly constant gnawing hunger that was a persistent companion for all of the truly poor. Some very kind monks even opened their welcoming doors to weary travellers, happily providing them with both a warm meal and a clean bed for the night, to those who simply could not afford to stay at a local inn. But even this incredibly generous generosity had some serious limits of its own. The overly powerful Church was also a massive landowner, directly controlling incredibly vast swathes of precious agricultural land and sprawling forests. And the poor peasants who dared to poach just a bit of game from these vast lands in order to directly feed their incredibly hungry families faced some severe punishments indeed. Severe punishments awaited those who disobeyed, ranging from hefty fines and brutal floggings to the ultimate penalty of exile. It wasn't lost on many that a supposedly charitable institution was amassing wealth while its members were starving. The profound impact of the Church's dietary restrictions on the medieval population simply can't be overstated. For individuals already struggling to secure enough food, the additional burden of religious fasting and abstinence could easily mean the difference between life and death. And yet the fear of eternal damnation served as an incredibly powerful motivator, compelling people to endure even the most extreme hardships for the sake of saving their immortal souls. Looking back today, we might view these practices as archaic and even outright cruel. However, for people living in the Middle Ages, these were fundamental aspects of their everyday existence. The Church held an unquestioned grip on the hearts and minds of the faithful, and its pronouncements carried the full weight of divine law. To defy them was to risk not only earthly punishment, but also the agonizing fires of hell itself. And so, with gritted teeth and rumbling stomachs, the people of the Middle Ages pressed onward, finding some small measure of comfort in the belief that their suffering would be rewarded in the world to come. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the rather depressing depths of medieval cuisine. It truly is a testament to human resilience that people manage to survive and sometimes even thrive on such a meagre and unreliable food supply. The scarcity, the spoilage, the sheer monotony of gruel and more gruel, it's enough to make anyone grateful for the simple pleasure of biting into a crisp apple or enjoying a well-spiced curry. Can you even imagine the utter astonishment on the face of a medieval peasant if they were suddenly transported to a modern supermarket? The brightly lit aisles overflowing with more food than could fill a king's banquet hall, the vibrant rainbow of fresh fruits and vegetables in the produce section, the fragrant loaves of bread that would have seemed like manna from heaven to a hungry serf, and the sheer abundance of it all. Enough food to feed an entire village, all conveniently located under one roof. Of course, we still face significant challenges within our modern food system. Issues like inequality, excessive waste, and environmental degradation are all problems that we must continue to address. But we have also made incredible progress since the days of rancid meat pies and endless turnip gruel. We possess a much greater understanding of nutrition, of food safety, and of the vital importance of variety and balance in our diets. We have developed the ability to preserve and transport food across vast distances, allowing us to enjoy flavours from around the world right in our own kitchens. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to truly savour it. Appreciate the complex interplay of flavours, the freshness of the ingredients, the skill that went into its preparation, and maybe spare a thought for our medieval ancestors, who endured so much hardship and hunger in the face of such pervasive scarcity. And with that, we reach the end of our boring History for Sleep episode about medieval food. I sincerely hope it has provided some interesting context to broaden your understanding of the past and perhaps even lulled you into a peaceful slumber. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel for more soporific historical content. Until next time, sweet dreams.